Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Congresswoman Niki Tsongas' telephone town hall meeting. This telephone town hall is like a traditional town hall meeting. Gives you a chance to hear from Congresswoman Tsongas about issues before Congress or anything that's on your mind, but from the convenience of your own home. In just a moment, Congresswoman Tsongas will give a few brief opening remarks. Then anyone on the call will have an opportunity to ask her your questions. If you'd like to ask a question at any point during tonight's call, simply press *3 on your phone. Now, that option is open now, so if you have a question, feel free to press *3 now, or again at any point during tonight's call. Since we anticipate that many people on the call will have questions, after pressing *3, you will be connected with a member of the Congresswoman's staff who will take down some of your information so that we can connect you with the Congresswoman in turn. We will try to get to as many questions as possible during the course of the next hour, and to do so, we unfortunately won't have time for follow-up questions. So please try to ask your full question when you come on the line with the Congresswoman. One quick technical issue that I want to point out before we get started is that there is sometimes a little bit of lag time in between the questions. So please stay with us if there is a brief pause in the discussion as we move on to the next question. We will try to get to as many questions as we can over the course of the next hour. We might not get to everyone's question, but if we are unable to get to your question tonight, you will still have an opportunity to leave it as a voicemail for the Congresswoman. And to do that, just stay on the line at the end of the call, and you will then be able to leave a message with your question, and the office will get back to you as soon as possible with an answer. And again, if you'd like to ask a question for Congresswoman Tsongas, please press *3 on your phone now. And with that, I will turn it over to Congresswoman Niki Tsongas.
Good evening and welcome. I want to welcome everybody to the call. I appreciate this opportunity to connect with you through these virtual town halls that lets me hear from you from the comfort of your own homes. I do hope you're enjoying this spring season. It's certainly been a cool one in Massachusetts, actually, as it has been in D.C., but hopefully summer is coming, and it usually comes all together too quickly once it decides to arrive. Here in D.C., it is a busy time of year. We're in the middle of some long sessions that will hopefully help us address some of the important issues facing our country. And I know that many of these issues are on your minds on a whole range of topics, and I will try to answer as many questions as possible during the next hour. To ask me a question or give your input at any point, just press *3 on your telephone. One issue that's been on the top of people's minds in the 3rd District for some time now is the proposed natural gas pipeline from Kinder Morgan. Recently, you may have heard that on April 20th, Kinder Morgan announced that they had suspended all work on the pipeline project and asked that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, known as FERC, pause its ongoing review, suspend reviewing its application. But today, actually earlier today, I was notified that Kinder Morgan has officially withdrawn their application for the pipeline from FERC. That is, again, the federal regulators, and the project has been terminated. Since Kinder Morgan first publicly announced plans to build the pipeline, I have been so impressed by the activism and commitment of 3rd District residents and communities to get up to speed on a very complex issue. As we know, New England faces energy challenges, and we need careful and strategic long-term planning so that we do have the lower energy prices and that the energy we do have is reliable. But like all large infrastructure projects with the potential for significant environmental degradation, not to mention impacts on private property, proposals for new natural gas pipelines have to be closely scrutinized. And I certainly appreciate the serious and thoughtful concerns raised by citizens in this district and really believe your efforts strengthen the public review process. I know I shared your many concerns. As new energy projects are proposed going forward, I will continue to make sure that the public input process remains transparent and robust, and we have seen how effective it can be. Again, to ask me a question or give your input at any point, just press *3 on your telephone. When Congress isn't in session, I've always made it a point to get out into the communities I represent to talk with constituents and local business owners. I'm in Washington generally 3 weeks out of a month, And in the off month, the fourth week of any given month, I'm back in the district, and this gives me the time I need to reach out and learn from all of you. Recently, I visited several local businesses and organizations during National Small Business Week. National Small Business Week is an opportunity to draw attention to the impact of outstanding entrepreneurs, small business owners, and many others in the local business communities. And while that week gave us an opportunity to focus on the work of several local small businesses, I also make it a priority to visit local companies and workers whenever I'm in the district, because it gives me a real opportunity to see what's taking place and the contributions these companies are making to our economy, and to hear from people working in them about how the federal government can be a better partner in helping small businesses succeed. Again, as a reminder, to ask me a question or give your input at any point, just press *3 on your telephone. I've also long been a strong supporter of a Make It in America agenda. This is particularly important, I think, coming from the Merrimack Valley, which was so rooted in the Industrial Revolution and where manufacturing is part of the culture of who we are. To make America a magnet for jobs, though, we have to invest in manufacturing, innovation, and infrastructure, and cut red tape to help businesses grow. So as an example of the kind of work I've done on this front, I've pushed for our military to invest in American manufacturing and stick to a long-established law called the Berry Amendment, which is an amendment that was passed during World War II to make sure that American soldiers trained and operated to the greatest extent possible with American-made uniforms and equipment. I also believe taxpayer dollars should, whenever possible, go towards supporting American goods and American jobs. But until recently, athletic footwear lacked a domestic producer, a producer in this country who could manufacture a 100% American-made shoe. And when I say 100%, I mean it. Every piece of it has to be American-made. So because of this absence of a domestic producer, our military got around the Berry Amendment by offering cash allowances to new recruits that they could use for running shoes as they undertook the training regimen. But today, the domestic shoe industry has rebounded, employing thousands of American workers throughout the country, and certainly many in Massachusetts. In 2014, recognizing the resurgence of footwear manufacturing in the United States, and with, I have to say, some strong advocacy from me and other members of Congress, the Defense Department agreed to change its policy and close this loophole. But despite that announcement 2 years ago, more than 2 years later, the Defense Department hasn't actually implemented this new policy and rectified this fundamental inequity in the application of the Berry Amendment. So I joined with Representative Bruce Poliquin, a Republican from Maine, to introduce legislation this year that requires the department to complete the policy change and stick to the Berry Amendment without using cash allowances that get around the law. Our work resulted in this provision being included in this year's Defense Authorization Act, which was approved by the House of Representatives just last week. So this is one step in the process. There is still more work to do, but this was a really important first step. Any U.S.-based manufacturer of footwear could compete to provide this 100 American-made athletic shoes to our new recruits, and multiple companies, including New Balance, located in Massachusetts with a strong presence in Lawrence, have already demonstrated their interest in doing just that. Again, as a reminder, to ask me a question or give your input at any point, just press *3 on your telephone. Many of the issues that we face in the 3rd District are also issues that communities across the country confront. Families from here to California are feeling the impact, among other things, of the tragic consequences of the opioid crisis. We are currently facing a nationwide epidemic of heroin and prescription drug abuse that is resulting in drastic increases in addiction rates, overdose deaths, and incarceration. I hear directly from people in the 3rd District. I just did a Congress on Your Corner this week and at a community in the 3rd District where I had many loved ones coming and talking about the challenges they're confronting with members of their family. And it reminds me how important it is that we need a comprehensive cooperative, resource resource-laden effort to effectively combat this crisis. I was encouraged to see that the House of Representatives, we did consider legislation earlier this month on this issue, and I'm so grateful and glad that Congress is bringing the kind of attention to this problem that it deserves. But the reality is, absent a robust funding, many of our good ideas really won't be effective. And so the follow-on debate really has to be about having sufficient resources for the fight against opioid abuse. We need new resources that can make real change, help people get the treatment they need, whether they're incarcerated or on the street or families struggling with appropriate mental health care facilities. And we have to stop the rising death toll from overdoses. The President's budget request recommends robust funding and deserves a closer look. Another national matter is the Zika virus. Again, last week, Congress voted on legislation to provide funding for combating the spread of Zika in the United States, but it was not adequate to the task. It essentially borrowed from Peter to pay Paul, didn't put any kind of new funding into it, the kind of funding that we have heard from experts who are looking to develop a vaccine. They need long-term, reliable funding that allows them to follow through on any kind of breakthroughs that they might find as a result of their research. And so I will be working with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to make sure we fully support the efforts to combat these two public health crises. Again, remember to ask me a question or give your input at any point. Just press *3 on your telephone. These are just a few of the important issues we confront as a nation and ways in which I feel fortunate to work to make a difference. As the 114th Congress moves on, your feedback is important for helping me focus on the priorities that matter most to you, and that is why this town hall, this telephone town hall, is a real chance for me to hear from you directly and let me know your thoughts on a particular issue. So I'm eager to hear your input and answer your questions. And with that, I'd like to turn it over now for your questions. Again, if you'd like to ask me a question, just press *3 on your telephone.
All right. Thank you very much, Congresswoman Tsongas. We're going to start off our first question tonight with Mary from Haverhill. Mary, you're on the line with Congresswoman Niki Tsongas.
Hello, Congressman. I have a question. I've been on strike for Verizon for almost 7 weeks now. I'm wondering when there is going to be a decision about the unemployment benefits, and I'm also questioning that there are quite a few of us that got denied for, help with food from the Department of Welfare. So because we're on strike, we are unable to receive these benefits. I'm a single mother of 3 children, and I'm not getting any income now for 7 weeks. So I'm just wondering if you have any information about unemployment or welfare or food stamps or anything like that that you would get to come our way. Again, we've been working. I have 27 years with Verizon, so I feel like I've been putting into this system, and now that I actually need it, I'm denied. So that's a big concern for me.
Well, a couple of things. One is, I think as you all first began your strike, I felt fortunate to go and meet with some of those who are on the picket line in Lowell, and understand that this is not an easy decision to make, to decide to strike. And I'm glad to see that people are back at the bargaining table. I'm hopeful, and I'm sure that we will all stay very focused on the outcome of that bargaining. But in terms of your access to your unemployment benefits and other things that you may need to make it through this period, I'd suggest you actually call my office, and we can connect you with a caseworker who can perhaps help you. So that number in Lowell is 978-459-0101. We're more than happy to help you. We have a good number of people who do work on what we call constituent services, and this is an example of a way in which we can help sort of navigate the system for you. So please do give us a call.
All right. Thank you, Mary, for your question. And we're going to move right along, and we're going to go to Bill in Methuen. Bill, you're up now on the line with Congresswoman Niki Tsongas.
Yeah, hi. This is it's Phil Leahy.
Oh, good evening, Phil.
Hey, Congresswoman, I know we've talked in the past. As you're aware, I'm president of the Merrimack Valley Prevention and Substance Abuse Project. We do a lot of work with a lot of volunteers when it comes to education, prevention, and awareness, and we do help people in treatment. But I got to be honest with you. Everybody, you just referred to it as an epidemic just a short time ago. State legislators refer to an epidemic. But you want to know something? If 3 people died from the flu, it would be an epidemic, and it would be all hands on deck. Everybody calls it an epidemic, but they really don't treat it that way. You not only need treatment, but you need something that Governor Baker suggested, involuntary treatment. And until we start seeing that along with the education, we're losing a whole generation.
Well, first of all, I thank you so much for your work because, as I said, as I think what's made this issue so real for many of us, if we haven't encountered in our own personal lives, is the families who've been willing to come forth and just tell their very difficult stories about the impact on their loved ones and too often the loss of a loved one. And so I commend families who are willing to do that. It's not there, as you say. It's not this is not an issue that's going to be easily solved. I think it's multifaceted in many respects, and I think Massachusetts has really taken the lead in some of its legislative actions to address this, not the least of which is just beginning to address the prescribing practices of physicians in the hopes that fewer of these drugs will be in the hands of vulnerable people. That's number one. But I have to say, as I have met with so many families, one of the real issues is the absence of there are treatment facilities out there, but there are many more people than there are places in those treatment facilities. So it seems to me that's why funding becomes so important, so that we can put aside the dollars to help address some of that. The other issue to me as well is just the shortage in mental health care professionals, whether it's dealing with the addiction itself or some of the underlying mental health care issues. This is certainly something this week I was reminded of again with so many families coming to tell me about their desperate search for help. So it's multifaceted. The one good outcome, I think, of this recent epidemic, which I do call it that, is that it's brought many people out of the shadows to talk about the ways in which they are wrestling with this or others in their family are wrestling with it. And I think it's helping all of us in elective office really search for some good answers. But as we know, it won't happen quickly. We did, as I said, consider a number of bills earlier this month. I was happy to vote in favor of them and happy to see the House take them up. But I do think, again, funding is so much of an issue that we've got to be sure we have the kind of funding over a good number of years that helps really move us ahead on addressing this. But thank you again for your work. And the issue of involuntary treatment is a challenging one, just one given the shortage of facilities and beds. But also there's a large debate here in Congress as to the nature of involuntary treatments, not just when it comes to opioids, but in many other mental health contexts. So I would welcome your input in the future on that issue because it's not a simple one. But thank you so much for being part of our discussion tonight.
All right. Thank you for that question. And Congresswoman, I believe you have a question for our listeners tonight. And go right ahead with our first poll question.
Well, this is really a follow-on question to the discussion we've been having. So the question is, our country and Massachusetts in particular has seen a disturbing rise in opioid addiction and death. Have you been personally affected by the opioid crisis? Press 1 for yes, press 2 for no. So press 1 for yes, press 2 for no.
All right, thank you, Congresswoman. And we're going to move right along to our next question. And our next question is going to be from Richard in Haverhill. Richard, you're on the phone right now with Congresswoman Niki Tsongas.
Hello, Niki. Thanks for inviting me to the call. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thank you for taking advantage of it.
Yeah, and look, caught me a little bit off guard, so I'm scrambling a little bit, I have to admit. But I was happy to hear the news about the Kinder Morgan request being dropped. I have started to follow the issue of the natural gas pipelines recently, and what came to my attention was the kind of broken nature of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that there's kind of a handful of concerns surrounding how they handle the proposals, not only from the fact that they kind of consider the proposals kind of in an isolated manner rather than considering from a regional point of view. They kind of seem to approve everything, let the market sort it out. And, they just seem to be a rubber stamping machine from what I have gathered so far. And also, that they do require these public hearings, but they don't really monitor or control the quality of information. And I did attend a Department of Public Utilities hearing in Dracut about a month ago or so ago, and heard some stories about the aggressive nature of Kinder Morgan's advent into the region, and the request for eminent domain proceedings even before the pipeline was approved. So kind of very troubling to kind of discover these things in the midst of learning that we should be keeping the fossil fuel in the ground, 80% of which needs to stay down there for us to meet goals, et cetera. So I'm wondering if you are doing anything about this, or if it's on your radar, and what possibly could be done. So thank you for taking the question.
Well, thank you, Richard. And you're not alone in terms of just how this proposed pipeline, I think, led a lot of people to become aware of a process that they otherwise would not have particularly paid attention to. And I do think we have to take heart from the fact that I gather that Kinder Morgan had never really had to deal with quite the community outcry and input that it experienced as a result of its proposed pipeline. This was they often, I think, propose these pipelines in areas that just don't have the concentrations of population, may not have the same kind. And given that we are a rather compact, small state, we value our conservation lands. We take very seriously our farmlands. We become very concerned about the impact on the value of private homes. All of these things we pay close attention to renewable energies and are committed to finding alternate sources of energy. So I think all of these things became part of their considerations as they were evaluating whether or not to go forward. And I think we've all learned a lot about it, and I think we now have an opportunity to look at and think about ways in which we might address changing the regulatory process around this, if it's possible. I mean, it would take legislative action, and as we know here in Washington, those things are not simple, but it certainly has highlighted, I think, some of the shortcomings. The reality is FERC looks to the market to decide if there is a need. It does not go out and assess what the energy needs are of a particular area. When a pipeline company comes forward to propose a pipeline, it lets the market dictate whether or not there is a need. And the way they evaluate that market is in terms of whether or not the pipeline gets sufficient number of companies to commit to contract for the gas. So in this instance, among many other things, Kinder Morgan could not put the contracts in place. And that was FERC's. That was a message to FERC that there was not a sufficient demand, and absent a demand, they will not approve a pipeline. So that is number one, and that is actually something that I became better aware of as we were moving through the process, just as Kinder Morgan was coming forward to suspend before it finally now withdrew it, but to suspend its pipeline project. So that's the way in which they evaluate whether or not there is a need, and it's something I think we have to be mindful of and look at what the alternatives might be. The other issue that I grew to be far more very concerned about too was once you admit a pipeline or any kind of energy-related facility into your community, it becomes much easier for a follow-on proposal to also target that community. So to me, it raises the whole issue of environmental justice. And so these are things I personally plan to continue to stay very interested in. But for the moment, this pipeline, this is done with, but there will be others, and we're going to have to stay on top of it should those proposals come forward. But thank you very much for your interest. Yours and many others, I think, made quite a difference in how this unfolded.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for your question. And I believe, Congresswoman, you have some results from our first poll question.
I do. So the question was, have you been personally affected by the opiate crisis? 24% of you on the line said yes, you have, and 76% you had not been impacted. But those numbers certainly speak to our need to stay very focused on this issue. So thank you.
All right. Our next question, moving right along, we're going to go to Michael in Andover. Michael, you're on the phone with Congresswoman Niki Tsongas.
Hello, Congresswoman. Thank you for taking my call.
Hi, Michael. How are you?
Good, thank you. Hey, I was having a conversation today with my son and his girlfriend. I'm a white male, but my son's girlfriend is African American, and they're two sharp kids. One of them, they both went to Phillips Academy, and they're both going to Columbia University in the fall. I've been a police officer for 32 years, and they brought to my attention that the war on drugs in the 1980s unfairly incarcerated minorities, mostly African Americans, at a rate of 100 to 1 white person during that era. And then recent legislation in 2010 changed the ratio of minorities incarcerated to 18 to 1 for drug violations. So we've made some improvements as a nation, dropping it from 100 to 1 to now it's 18 to 1. In this area, there still seems to be a very gross differential in police enforcement, prosecution by our district attorneys, stiffer court sentencing for minorities, especially targeting African Americans. There may also be similar problems in our court system in terms of executions across the United States. And these types of injustices, I think, impact our communities and nation negatively and should be perhaps addressed through like presidential pardons, legislation, governor pardons, early release programs, or improvement in our welfare system to perhaps eliminate dependency on welfare programs by creating job fair programs, vocational training, and greater educational opportunities for people that don't have access to these benefits. I also think it might be a good idea if there was like a congressional commission to study all of these areas and to make recommendations either to the President of the United States or to the state legislatures or governors so that the policymakers can improve policing, court prosecution, and judicial sentencing. And if you look at like Ferguson, the problems there, you've got like a disconnect between the police and the communities. And it would seem that if the police department was more reflective of the community, for example, if Ferguson, if the police were say the minority ratio is 20% African American, 10% white, and 10% Hispanic, wouldn't it make more sense if they tried to hire police officers that were say 80% African American, 10% white, and 10% Hispanic? So then the police are the community are the police. And
well,
also,
you raise a lot of questions, and I think there's been and these questions are being, I think, raised broadly across our country, and rightfully so, as people are really revisiting our criminal justice system and asking some of these hard questions, and that's true on both sides of the aisle. So, for example, here in Washington, there's been legislation introduced the Sentencing Reform Act. So one of the things that we've found is that mandatory minimum sentences requiring that a convicted criminal receive a minimum number of years in prison has really led to many people being incarcerated for modest, not modest, but more minor drug trafficking or more minor drug offenses. And so a hard look is being taken at whether or not those mandatory minimum prison sentences make sense. And so that's number one. Number two, for example, I just had a police chief from one of the communities in the Merrimack Valley come in today who's really invested in community policing over a good number of years, and they've become a real model for being well accepted in the community. It's a community that has a very diverse population, and they've been selected as one of 50 police departments to be studied and to come up with best practices and to serve as a mentor to other police departments that are trying to recognize that they have a need to reform. But just to validate what you said, that there are now 2.2 million people behind bars in the United States compared to 500,000 just 30 years ago. So we do have to look at sentencing reform. We've got to take on some of the initiatives you talked about to reduce repeat offenders so people are not going from school to jail, and support our law enforcement officials. I think that's so important to improving our public safety, but reducing some of the costs and making our criminal justice system more fair. So these are great, important issues you've raised and worthy of our consideration. But what I'm happy to see is that there is a bipartisan recognition that we do have to really take a serious look at all of this. And so I thank you for your call and being on this call.
All right. Thank you for your call and your question. And moving right along, we're going to go to John in Dracut. John, you're on the line with Congresswoman Niki Tsongas.
Good afternoon, Congresswoman.
Good afternoon.
I am very concerned about the attacks that have started primarily in the South, but are spreading to other states against gay, lesbian, and transgender people. Is there anything that Congress can do to raise this issue and to work on stopping these attacks against sexual minorities?
Oh, it's a good question, and one that's certainly very much in the forefront these days. You know, in 1979, my husband, Paul, who was at the time a United States Senator, was the first senator to introduce legislation to prohibit employment discrimination based on sexual orientation. It was an issue that came to him because he had a staffer who was gay and who was able to tell him just what he had experienced in the workplace. And I agreed with Paul then, and I feel just as strongly today about the importance of this cause. So I'm like you. I think our country is stronger for its commitment to defending the rights and human dignity of all American citizens. So what happened was we've yet to pass, for example, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. So on January, although we did have a vote on the floor of the House, I think in about 2009, finally. So because we had not passed it, on January 21st of 2014, President Obama signed an executive order that would prohibit federal contractors from discriminating in the workplace based on an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity. So what this executive order said was that taxpayer funds should never be allowed to subsidize discrimination. So federal contractors should not be allowed to fire a worker just because of who they are and what their sexual identity is. Last week, a congressman from New York offered an amendment to what we call the Military Construction and VA Appropriations Bill. It's a bill that decides how much money we're going to be spending for military facilities or within the VA. That would have upheld our president's order and to prevent contractors from discriminating. And when the time for that vote had expired, it looked like 217 votes were going to support it, leading many to believe that the amendment would pass. But the Republican leadership chose to extend the time for voting and pushed 7 Republican members to switch their vote. So in the end, the amendment failed, and which is so unfortunate. And what was more unfortunate is if the time for voting had come to an end when they realized that it was going to pass. And so the voting was held open, and usually if you want to change your vote, you have to take a piece of paper that registers your vote into the floor of the House, into the well of the House. Personally, you have to do it and go up and offer up a piece of paper that says, I want to switch from yes to no. Rather than doing that, they held open what we call our voting machines, which is right back where all the seats are, so that members could sort of quietly go and change their vote without having to walk into the well. So it was a shameful vote, both in terms of those members who were, I think, on the right side of history, who then went to change their vote, and also the way in which they were allowed to change their vote. So there's much work to do, but I'm proud of Massachusetts' role in leading the way for LGBT rights. We certainly did it when it came to marriage equality, and we have a lot more work to do. And beyond what happens in Massachusetts, I think any of us in elective office have to condemn the kind of discriminatory acts that are taking place in other states. But we know Massachusetts people are welcome, but it's still not easy, and it takes all of us supporting our brothers and sisters and other family members who happen to be LGBT.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that question. And I just want to remind everybody, if you have a question and you'd like to ask, just press *3 on your phone at any point during tonight's call. That's press *3, and you'll be able to ask your question. We're going to move along right now. We're going to go to Fred in Dracut. Fred, you're on the phone right now with Congresswoman Niki Tsongas.
Hi, good evening.
Hi, Fred. How are you?
Good, thank you. I want to know what you're doing to help out or lead in the investigation of Planned Parenthood and its sale of fetal body parts.
Well, I thank you for that question. For nearly a century, Planned Parenthood, I think, has been one of the nation's leading providers of high-quality, great health care for women. I think it's fundamentally changed attitude towards women's health, women's reproductive freedom, and has provided a kind of health care that women had not received historically, and given women more control over their health care decisions. Planned Parenthood does receive a portion of their funding from something called Title X, which is the only federal program dedicated to providing women and men with comprehensive family planning and related preventative health services that help reduce the number of unintended pregnancies, but more importantly, improve women's health. But none of those funds can be used for abortion. They're used for pelvic examinations, breast and cervical cancer screening, and other kinds of preventative education, as well as pregnancy diagnosis. But as I said, it doesn't fund abortion services. In fact, it's been a key factor in reducing unintended pregnancies and abortions in the United States. So I support Planned Parenthood's efforts, its commitment to women's health, and I for one will not be one seeking to undermine what Planned Parenthood does and does so well.
All right. Thank you for your question. Again, if you have a question, please press *3 on your phone, and you'll be connected. And we're going to move right along to Henry in Andover. Henry, you're on the line with Congresswoman Niki Tsongas.
Yes. Hello, Congresswoman.
Hello, Henry. How are you?
Fine, fine, thank you. In a campaign stop some years ago, your late husband said something I thought was very true, and I'm surprised it needed saying. But he advised his followers that you can't love employment and hate employers. And I've always been curious as to why the Democrat Party seems so hostile to business, especially large business and wealthy investors.
Well, that statement you referenced to Paul still rings in my head, because I know as he was campaigning for president across New Hampshire, he would say it often. and he was always looking for ways to be supportive of how you grow our economy, while you also do right by its employees as well. The way in which I address it is, just by visiting the many companies across the district. I don't know if you were on early on in the line, but early on in the call, but during Small Business Week, I visited all the extraordinary small startups we have, the sort of entrepreneurial companies, but also the smaller retail businesses that so many are engaged in. And I often say, as I come from one of these companies, I understand a third of what you do, especially on the more entrepreneurial side, but I'm so glad about what you do. The way I look at being helpful, and I am a Democrat, is to be supportive of programs like the Small Business Innovation Research Program, which is a set-aside program that was actually started by Senator Kennedy. It recognized that the federal government has to be a strategic partner with businesses, that there are things that the federal government can do to help support nascent and emerging technologies by providing some funding in the early cycle of things. And when venture capitalists or those who are looking to make investments it's too much in the early stages of development for venture capitalists to want to risk their funds on it. So the federal government, through a competitive process, can make those funds available. And it's a program that I learned about when I first got elected. It was due to be reauthorized, and in the process, some changes were going to be made that the small business growth companies weren't happy with. Massachusetts happens to receive the second largest number of awards to companies actually all across Massachusetts, some right in Andover, in your neighborhood. And from those investments, companies flower because they're able to move these innovative ideas ahead, test them out, and where they make sense, it leads to yet another company based on that new innovation. So I certainly look at that as a way to be a partner and understand the federal government has a positive role to play. We also impose, I think, some regulatory burdens that can be awfully tough. I know that when we are enacting the Affordable Care Act, small businesses, small growth companies came to us with just saying some of the paperwork requirements were so burdensome and just something that would be so costly. So we worked immediately across the aisle to reduce those regulatory burdens. But I'm also one to say that, when a company is offshoring and moving, seeking to avoid paying its fair share of taxes into our system and help to support all the good things that our country needs, I'm going to be one that's supportive of kind of changes in the corporate tax law so that doesn't happen. So I would never say, as I hear Paul in my head all the time, and I always look for ways to be supportive of business while I also recognize the valuable role you play in creating jobs, not to mention all you do for moving us ahead as a country. But there has to be fair play all around.
All right. Thank you for your question. And again, if you want to ask a question, please press *3 on your phone. And I believe, again, Congresswoman, you have another question for our participants tonight with our next poll question.
I do. This question is, do you believe the United States Senate should hold confirmation hearings in order to fill the vacancy on the Supreme Court? Press 1 for yes. Press 2 for no. So again, the question is, do you believe the United States Senate should hold confirmation hearings in order to fill the vacancy on the Supreme Court? Press 1 for yes. Press 2 for no.
All right. Thank you very much. And we're going to go right on to our next question, and it is from Rose in Methuen. Rose, you're on the line with Congresswoman Niki Tsongas.
Yes. Good evening, Congresswoman.
Good evening, Rose.
My name is Rose Omezi. Last year, I was diagnosed with breast cancer stage 3, and prior to that, I was working 2 jobs. Right after I was diagnosed, my employer told me they cannot keep my position. I applied for disability. 3 times I was denied. Despite the fact my doctors, they supplied all the necessary papers needed for them to approve my disability, and I will appreciate any help you can render. at this time, I have 2 teenage girls that I support.
Well, we are happy to help work with you. So if you don't mind calling my office tomorrow, again, we have a good number of staff who work on what we call constituent services. We're often engaged, whether it's around somebody who has a problem with the veteran VA or with Social Security or with Medicare or Medicaid or whatever it may be. We have people who are expert in helping to navigate the federal government on those issues. So I would ask that you call my office tomorrow. The number there is 978-459-0101. Again, it's 978-459-0101. But I'm also so sorry to hear about your diagnosis of breast cancer. And that is why one of the things I strongly feel is that the federal government has to invest in medical research that helps get at the causes and treatments for some of these illnesses. The National Institutes of Health is certainly a very important part of that research. And as we debate funding in Washington, where our dollars should go, we certainly have to well protect our country and be prepared to support our soldiers. But as we debate the kinds of investments we make, we also need to be very mindful of all the good that comes from investing in the National Institutes of Health as we struggle, and people like you struggle with such serious illnesses. So please do call my office tomorrow. I know these can't be simple times for you.
All right. Thank you for your question. And Congresswoman, I believe you have some results from our most recent poll question.
I do. The question again was, do you believe the United States Senate should hold confirmation hearings in order to fill the vacancy on the Supreme Court? 78% of you said yes. 22% of you said no. So I certainly agree with you, and we'd like to see them take this up because we see the consequences of their doing nothing given the impasse in the Supreme Court.
All right, thank you very much. And our next question is going to be from Valerie in Haverhill. Valerie, you're on the line with Congresswoman Niki Tsongas.
Hi, Nikki.
Hi, Valerie.
How you doing? Thank you so much for having this. I was on last year, too. I didn't get to ask you a question, but this is a fantastic thing you're doing.
Well, thank you for hanging in again tonight. So you could ask a question. Yeah.
Yeah, I had to ask a question this time. I got some information last night that has shaken me to the core. I have been was an environmental major many years ago and have been very concerned about the environment, and I been looking for something to throw myself into now that I have some time freed up in my older age. And I saw a documentary called Cowspiracy on Netflix last night and was absolutely stunned to discover that the UN and World Watch has labeled that animal agriculture is the leading cause of our environmental destruction. I think I had probably still maintained some hope that we could turn this global warming, around, thinking it was basically fossil fuels. But even in the late 70s, when I was first getting involved, scientists had already been saying we were pretty much getting to the point of no return. And now I'm just been shaken to the core. It feels like we're in a burning house and we're aiming squirt guns at it to put the fire out. And what do any of these other issues even mean in comparison to that? And I think to myself what my grandchildren are going to suffer in these last days, and all because people want to still keep eating meat. And I've become an instant vegan. And I don't know what to do. I just accept.
Don't accept it. Just don't, because it is such a critical issue, and whether it's the animals, the ways in which animal agriculture is contributing to it, or our own reliance on fossil fuels, or whatever it may be, there's no denying that that climate change is for real, that it's caused by our decisions, the decisions we make, whether it's the sources of energy we use or some of the other economic activities we engage in, and that is something that requires our country's leadership, but it also requires the countries across the globe to come together for the sake of our children. You're absolutely right. So it does take a commitment from us in Washington, but for everybody at home as well. And so I think we were all gratified to see that the agreement at the United Nations at the Climate Change Conference in Paris does set a framework for countries all over the world to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions from whatever source they may come. Cumulatively, they've got to emphasize and meet some real targets. I think the problem a bit is enforcing those targets, but this is a good agreement that it holds real promise. So, which is why I do think, as we watch the presidential election, that we pay attention to where our presidential candidates are on this issue, because if the leadership doesn't come from the top, it's very difficult to move this ahead. I have to say, one of the first things I did, and again, this is an issue that I've been mindful of for years, and so was happy when one of my first votes in Congress was it's a modest thing, but to increase fuel efficiency standards for the first time in more than 30 years. And to also begin the process of putting more federal dollars behind alternative energy sources and energy efficiency technology. So these are steps, a multitude of steps that we have to take. But unfortunately, we do have too many who are in elective office who continue to put their heads in the sand and reject any notion that climate change is a fact or that it is attributable to human activity. And so we do have work to do. But it also prevents an economic opportunity. So, for example, in Massachusetts, clean energy jobs have grown by about 45% in the past 5 years, and it's now a $10 billion industry. So, it's a win for our climate. It's also an economic win for Massachusetts, given the innovative companies out there who really take this challenge seriously and are working hard at it. But I do encourage you not to become overwhelmed by it. If you support candidates who believe that it's real, you really do finally help push us to a place where we have a consensus and we can implement more far-ranging legislation. But it is a serious issue. I share your concern for my own grandchildren as well as yours and as well as our own children. So it's something we just can't afford to ignore. But again, I think it's so important we pay attention to it in this presidential year where the candidates are on this. Now I want to go to another question, another poll question. What issue do you feel Congress should prioritize the most in the coming months? So what are the most important issues to you? Press 1 for job creation. Press 2 for public health challenges like the Zika virus or opioid crisis. Press 3 for addressing climate change. Press 4 for responding to international situations like those in Syria and Iraq. Or press 5 for other. So press 1 for job creation, 2 for public health challenges like the Zika virus or opioid crisis, 3 for addressing climate change, 4 for responding to concerning international situations like those in Syria and Iraq, and press 5 for other. And with that, I want to thank everyone for participating in tonight's telephone town hall. This discussion was so helpful to me, as it always is. I value so much hearing directly from you about the matters that you really care about. If I didn't have a chance to get to your question this evening, there will be an opportunity to leave me a voicemail in just a minute, and we'd be happy to get back to you on your question. But when you leave it, it is very important, if you want to get a response to your question, that you also leave your name, your address, your phone number, and your email address. You can also visit my website at www.tsongas.house.gov or follow me on Facebook and Twitter to learn more about what I'm working on, or to email me any thoughts or questions. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/reptsongas and on Twitter at Niki in the House. Thanks again so much for choosing to participate in tonight's telephone town hall meeting, and have a good evening. Thank you. Bye.